Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CJCA Positive Youth Development Committee Education Webinar Series. This is our 8th in a series of webinars this year, focused on education in the juvenile justice system. Today's webinar is focusing on outcomes and measurements, and I want to thank you all for taking the time to participate in this webinar series. And a special thanks to Peter Forbes and Michelle Phillips, both from Massachusetts DYS, Phil Harris from Temple University, and Simone Gonsolin from the American Institute of Research, who have all put a great deal of work into preparation of these webinars, as well as I want to thank our presenters for today, who Peter will introduce in a few minutes. For those of you who are on the call who might be new to CJCA, we are a national nonprofit organization formed in 1994 to improve the juvenile justice systems, local secure correctional and residential facilities, services, programs, and most importantly, the long-term outcomes for youth and their families. CJCA represents the youth juvenile justice system CEOs in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and various major metropolitan counties all across the country. With that, thank you again for being on the call today, and I'm going to turn it over to Jonah, who is in our Braintree office, for a few technical directions. Jonah.
Thank you, Mike. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started here. All attendees will be muted for this webinar. However, you can ask questions at any time by typing them into the GoToWebinar control panel. There will be a Q&A session at the end of both presentations, and we'll get to all of your questions then. The webinar is also being recorded. A link to the audio-video recording, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, will be sent out to all attendees and all those who registered following the close of the webinar in the next day or so. And with that, I will turn it over to Peter Forbes for some introductions of our presenters today. Peter?
Sure. Thank you, Jonah. This is Peter Forbes, the Commissioner of the Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts and the Chair of the CJCA Positive Youth Outcomes Committee. Mike recognized the planning team, Simone, Phil, and Michelle, so I won't do that again. I would like to give the team at CJCA a shout out for supporting this series and helping us make this happen. So thank you very much. We have two high-powered presenters today that have extensive histories. I've paired their bios way back, so I'm just going to do a quick intro on Jeffrey Butts and Philip Harris. Jeff is the director of the Research and Evaluation Center at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and an adjunct member of the Doctoral Faculty in the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Previously, Jeff was the director of the program on youth justice at the Urban Institute in DC and senior research associate at the National Center for Juvenile Justice in Pittsburgh. Dr. Butts has managed $37 million of research projects and worked with policymakers and justice practitioners in 28 states and several countries. He has published 2 books, dozens of monographs and reports for government agencies, as well as articles in academia and peer-reviewed journals. We're very fortunate to have Jeff on today. Thank you, Jeff. Phil Harris, again, Phil is an emeritus professor of criminal justice at Temple University, where he taught extensively on juvenile justice policy, organization and management, and program and policy development for over 35 years. He chaired the Temple's Department of Criminal Justice from 91 to 1997, and directed research on police and correctional decision-making and specialized in evaluations of juvenile delinquency programs. He's currently working with colleagues at Temple and 5 other universities on a national research project, the NIDA-funded JJ trials. Phil has been an advisor to the Council for Juvenile Correctional Administrators since its creation in 1994, and Phil is actually the person that encouraged us to do a series on education. So those are very abbreviated bios, and I'm going to go right to Jeff. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm happy to be here with everyone today to talk about this important topic. And the main challenge with this topic, and you'll probably hear this when you talk to your own colleagues, is it seems like common sense to focus on achieving positive outcomes for young people caught up in the justice system. And because it seems like common sense, we all think it should be easy. But it's often very difficult. We know that if young people feel connected to their communities and have skills with which they can support themselves and feel like they belong, they have an investment in civilization and their larger communities, and they naturally will be less likely to remain involved in criminal behavior or delinquent behavior. So positive outcomes does equal public safety. We know from decades of research that young people with pro-social assets are less likely to be involved in risky behavior. We know that those assets are critically being attached to people, feeling engaged, feeling valued, having a sense of usefulness and belonging. All these things are not questioned. The challenge is how to deliver them. And there's no single strategy. There's no evidence-based program that you can sign up to have in your facilities or in your jurisdictions. Unfortunately, the only way to do this is to build a network and to have young people have access to a lot of different activities, and even within a facility, to pay attention to a lot of things rather than simply focusing on compliance. And that's where it gets tricky. But we know that and this is why it's common sense, that basically every young person needs the same stuff that youth in wealthy communities take for granted. And that's anything that you want your own kids to have. Again, that sense of belonging, being engaged, physical activity, sports, and good facilities do try to do this. But as you all know, the challenge is how do you fund them? How do you bring them in? Do you try to have 3 staff people do all this stuff? Do you have local schools involved in your facilities? Do you try to do education yourself? It just gets complicated. But if we don't take our eye off the ball and focus on achieving positive outcomes, we'll all be in better shape. And again, I say there's strong correlational evidence. This goes back decades. This is one of the more obvious ones. You've probably all heard of the Search Institute and their 40 developmental assets. When they did it's 15 years old, when they did a survey of a broad sample of young people and just asked them simple questions that covered the 40 assets, you see obviously young people with more assets are less likely to be involved in problematic behavior. So just look at the middle line there. They asked a series of questions that allowed you to measure whether young people will admit to having 3 or more acts of fighting, hitting, injuring a person, carrying or using a weapon, threatening physical harm. And then in the same survey, they asked about those assets. Do you have activities? Do you feel like the adults listen to you? Do you have a place to go on the weekends? Do you a variety of all those 40 assets? And when a young person had almost all the assets, you can see the number there on the far right, only 6% of those kids with a lot of assets admitted to being engaged in violence, whereas a young person with very few assets, fewer than 11, 0 to 10, 62% admitted to having engaged in some form of violence. So this is correlational. This says when you have good things in your life, you're less likely to act out in a negative way. The challenge is if a young person doesn't have that naturally in their own neighborhoods, their own communities, their own families, how do we create that? How do we deliver that? And that's always the challenge. I guess I just said that. So how do we get agencies to make the right choices? There's so much stuff to choose from. You're just overwhelmed with reports and monographs and manuals and evidence-based this and that. How do you make choices, and what's the frame you use to know whether you're making the right choices? So what does it take to really build evidence? Everyone now is focused on evidence-based practices. And I always tell people, if you ever hear someone use the phrase evidence-based practice with the definitive article in front of it, the word if they say the evidence-based practices, you know you're talking to a salesperson and not a developer, innovator, partner, because there's no such thing as a defined set of evidence-based practices. Ideally, we all see evidence as something that is continuing to build, continuing to grow, and it's all of our responsibility to help pull that off. And that means continuing to invest in testing either new ideas or new ways of implementing old ideas. We have to be agnostic and open to new facts. for developing these positive approaches. You can't just walk in thinking you have all the answers. And when I say you, I mean practitioners, people in the policy environment, researchers, anyone who thinks they already know everything they need to know is just not paying attention. The central goal is to find effective approaches to achieving positive outcomes for young people, and not just to deliver a particular type of service or to deliver services in a way that helps support the financial stability of a partner of your own agency. That's what I mean when I say keeping your eye on the ball, is really, can we increase the probability that a young person leaving the justice system will have the positive assets we want to see, meaning rebuilt relationships with families, a pathway to employment, a pathway to finishing school, or an actual GED or high school equivalency completion. All those features of positive outcomes are what we need to see movement on. And it's not sufficient just to say we have a school program. It's not sufficient to say we have work preparedness workshops. You have to be able to tie together the efforts of the justice system with those actual outcomes. And that's where it gets tricky and very complicated, even from a research perspective. But the one thing that sets my alarm bells off when I'm talking to facilities and practitioners and people in systems is when they think they've checked all the boxes because they have drug treatment, they have mental health treatment, whatever those boxes are, and they stop thinking about building stronger evidence for outcomes. And imagine if we lived in a world where the public heard the functions of the youth justice system, and then at the end of that description, we were able to say things like, and we know when young people come out of our system, their chances of being employed have increased by a factor of 2. They are 80% more likely to finish high school. With those numbers attached to the outcomes, you could start to see the conversation about youth justice change, and that's where we want to be. But it's not simple to do that, because to do research on this, you need to measure both what we do in the system, meaning inputs, what happens as a result of that, meaning, so if the input is education or training in high school equivalency, the output is classes attended, tests taken, equivalencies established. You need to have the outputs, and then the outcomes are tying that into the long-term outcome. So if within a school system, think about the input as geography class, the output is standardized tests passed, and the outcomes are employment. That we can assert that, we can claim that rhetorically, but it's a difficult task to pull it together. To build evidence, that means we need to have data, not just aggregate numbers, but data built at the individual level. So for each kid, we know what they got, we know whether they participated, how intensively, and we have a series of outcomes that show whether those improved or decreased over the long term. And long term, in some cases, could be 6 months. It might be 2 years. But you have to have not just the count. So not just 82% of kids went to school, but we know that this individual kid attended this many classes and passed this many tests, and here's where they stand right now in terms of employment. And that database has to be built for every young person in the system, which means you need research partners. No facility, no system can do all this with your own internal staff, because as you all know, you ask a lot of your internal analytics staff and data staff. You do need outside research partners to do this, but they have to be real partners. What you want to avoid is what I hear called simple evaluations. And that's where you just take a bunch of stuff and you throw it into the bucket. You think about drug treatment, you do a little therapy, you focus on whether they comply, you add some, a magic dust of case management, and you just throw it all in there. And then at some point you look at your outcomes and see whether that soup ended up developing or generating outcomes. That is not sufficient. That's not evaluation. That could be called reporting, and that could be useful. But in order to really have evidence about your efforts and whether they result in the outcomes you're trying to affect, you need to have that individual level data structure built over time. And to make those choices and to think about where to make your investments and what to collect, you have to think about criminal behavior, delinquent behavior from a broad perspective. We all know that risk has a lot to do with behavior, and there's a whole drawer full of things you could measure and be concerned about in terms of what are the risk factors that increase illegal behavior, but we also know that protective factors have a lot to do with it. And there's a whole nother drawer full of things like that. So which of these things do you measure? How do you build your approach to data? All this has to be done with consciousness and with attention to detail. And that's why I say you need research partners. But you can't measure everything. If you're measuring everything at the same time, you're not building evidence. So you have to make choices about evidence. Basically, we need programmatic approaches that are evidence-based, suitable for all youth, as it says they're not only those primarily affected by mental health or substance use issues, designed to support behavior change, focus on protective factors, healthy development, not just risk mitigation, and suitable for collection of individual level inputs, outputs, and outcomes, especially the positive outcomes. And finally, we did a report here at John Jay recently where we attempted to go through and collect all the existing frameworks that could be available to people for building such an approach. And the ones we found, you would find too if you looked. So as I said before, there's the developmental assets from the Search Institute. There's the 5 C's of positive development, developed by Dr. Lerner at Tufts University, which you could read about and are available. There's the Weichert Center, who does this interesting, more applied work with building quality programs, and they have their own frameworks, and there's a whole website you could read about that. The Center for the Study of Social Policy has their own framework for positive youth development with, again, their own collection of materials and manuals, so you could overwhelm yourself with all this. And then I worked with a colleague a couple of years ago on something we called the positive youth justice model, where we just tried to articulate, if you really wanted to accomplish positive outcomes for young people, here are the things you would focus on. And that report is available on either my personal website, which is jeffreybutts.net, or the website here where I work, which is johnjrec.nyc. But these are all just different ways of framing this. And so we reviewed them in this report. I made that bit.ly link for you. So it's bit.ly positive youth outcomes, and there's that report there. It has links in it so you can follow all these frameworks. And none of this is magic, and none of it is brand new. Every parent who's tried to take a 10-year-old and turn them into a healthy, happy 20-year-old knows what these key ingredients are. But in order to do it within an organizational setting, you need to be strategic. You need to focus on how to accomplish this in whatever setting you're working in, and build it over time and build the evidence so that you can prove that it works. The one thing we always have to fight is the cynicism of elected officials, policymakers, and the public who think the only thing to do with a young person who's breaking the law is to confine them and control them. They need to understand that by far, most young people, even involved in the justice system, have the capacity to develop into positive young adults and positive young people. They just need the right strengths, supports, and assets in order to do that. So I think I will turn it over at this point to Phil, and then we'll have a conversation.
Hello, everyone. And thanks to Jeff for your valuable presentation. Jeff has been hugely influential in bringing a positive youth development perspective to juvenile justice, and for helping us think about how to measure positive youth outcomes. Much of what I'll be talking about relates to work I've done with CJCA. One of our first challenges, ironically, was to define and measure recidivism. Like, what does recidivism mean, and how do you measure it? And what this work did, of course, was highlight the need for measurement of specific outcomes. In this work, really, there are 3 problems with recidivism and other unwanted outcomes of measures of success. Using unwanted outcomes as measures of success. First, recidivism feeds into a culture of suppression and compliance rather than one that supports positive change. Second, recidivism isn't specific enough. In fact, it's a useless concept. We use a number of measures to indicate new offenses, and depending on which ones we use, we get different recidivism rates. And if we use reincarceration, which many states do, we're treating new offenses and technical violations as equally bad, and they're very different measures. So we need to be very careful. Thirdly, states are using different measures. Then what we're seeing is a problem where one state will say, well, how come this other state's recidivism rate is superior to ours? Well, in all likelihood, we're not using the same measures to count recidivism. Just to give you an example, in Colorado, they use filing of new charges in court as their measure of recidivism. In Arizona, they use reincarceration as their measure of recidivism. So if you compared those rates between those two states, you get very different counts. As Jeff pointed out, a positive youth development perspective recognizes youth as full of potential. Some kids are held back by harsh environments that they've lived in for a long period of time, by trauma, and by mindsets that serve as barriers to growth, thinking that they can't achieve, that they're not bright enough. For example, few kids and even adults know that their IQ can change, it can grow, it can develop. So we can become smarter than we are today. Reducing self-doubt and helping kids explore their capabilities and interests are really keys to healthy development. Measurement of positive change in the lives of delinquent kids is necessary if we're going to have the positive youth development perspective have an impact on the juvenile justice system. Since what we measure and report reflects what we see as important to us, objectives that are not directly measured become mere rhetoric. And so we can give nice lectures and we can advocate for a positive youth development perspective, but if we wanted to have an impact, we have to have data. We have to bring data to the table, to probation officers, to judges, to legislators, to show them the impact that programs are having. As we've seen with program recidivism rates, which have largely influenced funding and policy decisions, and even the program evaluation enterprise, what we measure and report on impacts decision-making by important stakeholders. For positive youth development to take hold, we're going to have to emphasize the positive changes in kids when we speak to stakeholders. And you'll see on the slide this one area of benefits of measuring positive youth outcomes, and I want to take you to the last one, because here, I think one of the problems we face is developing collaborations with other youth-serving agencies, whether it's behavioral health providers, school districts, or even recreational providers in the community. We need those partnerships in particular if we want kids to access the kinds of resources that they're going to need to move forward in their lives. Often we face problems in working with other agencies because we don't speak the same language as they do. Our goals are slightly different. But more importantly, we don't share data. And I think the sharing of data across agencies is absolutely critical. I know there are obstacles to doing that, but they're not insurmountable. They've been done, and we should continue to pursue the sharing of data. When we began working on thinking about measuring positive youth outcomes, the CJCA folks created a menu of outcomes that they believed were important, measurable, and achievable within the time frames of typical juvenile system involvement. We want kids to see themselves as learners. We want them to see themselves as developing towards something. We want them to have goals for their own futures. We also want them to feel attached to other people. We want them to have positive connections to people but also develop relationship skills that can be translated into school and work settings. We want them to have knowledge about health, about their own physical health, emotional health, and the kinds of risks that they'll be tempted to get involved in, but understanding what those risks actually mean. I'm going to show you a couple of slides here that break some of this out for us and give you a sense of some of the outcomes that we might want to consider measuring. First, we want to see kids as engaged in a learning process and as developing interest in specific areas of learning. Now, these areas can be academic, they can be vocational, they can be creative, such as the arts. And we want them to have opportunities to explore all of those areas, not just the academic. Secondly, the outcomes listed here are important since they can be integrated with historical data and future involvement with educational institutions. In particular, as Jeff pointed out, in tracking individual kids over time and looking at changes in their lives, in their experiences, and the impact of that on their futures. In many cases here, state has required educational standards and measures. It's certainly critical that you're complying with those requirements so that as kids move on to other learning environments, they carry those credentials with them. In the second slide, we shift a little bit and maybe to some areas you haven't considered, but that are related to the successful development of kids in your care. You may want to think about other outcomes in these areas, but these are a few. I think we're gonna look at a couple of tools for measuring these in a minute, but you certainly can develop some of your own outcome data as long as you have a minimum capacity to track data over time. In one of our recent webinars, Frank Martin of World Possible introduced us to several tools for bringing technology into the classroom, both in terms of hardware and software. What this webinar emphasized was how important it is for all kids to be comfortable with computers, with the internet, and with the kinds of software common in the workplace. Their success in becoming proficient with technology is relatively easy to measure. Lastly, credentials lend themselves to simple counting as your agency seeks to improve its educational outcomes. They indicate both the extent to which youths are engaged in learning and the quality of educational services you are providing. Of course, youth benefit from credentialing as they move on to school and work setting. And it's important that these credentials not have more than just meaning within your facility, but are actually meaningful outside in the workplace or in an educational setting. We've looked at a few of the risk needs scales that some of you have encountered, and here are some examples of ones that are out there. And as you can see, if you look at the column on educational vocational skills and on attachment to school you'll see that all of these have those items checked. Now, they're not going to measure them in exactly the same way, so it's important to compare them. And I think it's also important that if you aren't using one of these or don't have a good tool to use, that you investigate this with other states, other state agencies. But the first one coming down the left-hand side is the Positive Achievement Change tool, which was developed in Washington State. It's one of the ones that has a residential version and a community version, which I guess can be a real advantage if you're following kids into the community. The second is the Youth Assessment and Screening Instrument. Again, a number of states are using that one. The Youth Level of Service case management inventory, the positive youth justice tool developed for the District of Columbia, and Jeff was instrumental in helping them develop that tool to measure the domains that the positive youth justice framework has promoted. And then the Oregon Youth Authority risk needs assessment. Now, all of these have risk and needs contained in them. This probably was a starting point for them, but they've added these other important components, and all of these are interrelated. And it's great to have all of these data compiled into one data set. It's also the case that all of them have the capacity to assist with case management. So there may have a really separate piece of the tool specifically for case managers thinking about a youth at a particular point in time. Keep in mind that different kids will be at different stages of achievement when you start working with them. And so development will look different as you move from case to case, from kid to kid. So be very careful when you're aggregating data that you take that into account, that it's improvement that's important. It's not simply getting a specific credential within 9 months or a year. So think about how to analyze data looking at movement forward across kids. But again, coming back to Jeff's point, having individual level data is really critical. I'm going to turn things to Simone at this point. And Simone, if you would let us know if we have some questions to deal with, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Phil and Jeff. We appreciate the information you share with us today. You've really given us a great deal of information to chew on here. So we do have a few questions, and then I know Jeff and Phil, you want to have a little dialogue too about your presentations. So the first question we have, Jeff, this is probably more for you because it relates to one of your slides. It says, on one of your slides, you mentioned there is a need to be focused on the youth's positive protective factors as systems look at evaluating programs. Can you identify a few of these protective factors you are referencing, especially as it relates to educational outcomes?
Sure. There's a school in criminology that people talk about a lot under various names, but it basically brings the insight of social bonding, that we're less likely to violate the rules when we feel that the rules make sense for us and we feel identified with them and we connect with other people who also identify with them. And that rather simple insight is important to translate into organizational efforts and agency efforts. I think what we tend to do is focus too much on risk factors and not think about all the positive things you need to build up with a young person. And it's not just young people, it's all of us are more likely to play by the rules when we think we're respected by whatever system invented those rules. And some young people grow up in environments where they do not get that message, and they get the exact opposite message with only suckers play by the rules, and you're only a man, for example, if you learn how to get around the rules and other people can see you flout them. And so to undo all that and to get people to, young people to feel more connected, I was going to say it's a simple process. It's not. It's a simple idea that can be a complicated process of giving every young person in your systems the concrete experience. I always say this, but I would want every adolescent every day to hear someone say, "Wow, how did you learn to do that? That's amazing. You can do that." That's a simple recognition of a skill of improving learning. It doesn't have to be someone's algebra test. It could be, some young person in a sound studio figured out how to get the mix just right and turn the bass up so that everyone loves it, and no one else knew how to do that, and they get praised for it. It's a very simple thing, but how do you build in a structure of interventions where every young person has that experience on a regular basis, and not just skill development, but everything else we just talked about? So those are all protective factors, and we need to monitor those, deliver services to enhance those, and test ourselves on whether we're actually accomplishing our goals.
Thanks. Phil, do you want to add to that, or are you ready to move on?
Yeah. I mean, I think that what Jeff said is really great. It's important for us to think about those things in a youth life that help them feel part of the larger environment in which they live, their community, their family, and which is one of the reasons probably why, if you look at community evaluations of community programs, that family-based programs are relatively powerful. I mean, as Jeff said, we need to continue to learn about those things, but we've got this whole set of family-based programs that have had quite an impact. But that the idea of protective factors also involves positive youths and finding ways to help kids engage with kids that are on a positive trajectory themselves and encourages other kids. One other thing I want to say is that it's pretty easy to measure achievements like grades or attendance or an achievement test of some kind, but kids need to be rewarded for the process itself, for the work that they've put into learning something, and that's something we often lose track of as we focus on data.
Okay, thanks. We have another question that's pretty similar, and Jeff, the person who directed it to you once again, but Phil, please jump in here. It says, Jeff, you had a slide on risk and protective factors. Can you talk about the importance of measuring and tracking both risk and positive or protective indicators, and how those two interplay with each other and potentially making decisions for the youngster or promoting, positive youth outcomes?
Yeah. Think about the school environment. If we weren't evaluating or trying to build strong programs within a youth justice setting, but instead we're just talking about a school, and imagine I came to you as your research expert and I said, I have all these recommendations for curriculum and coursework and what makes good teaching, but I'm not going to measure those. I just want to know what your dropout rate is. And that's the only way we're going to judge which schools get closed. So Chicago closed a bunch of schools in the recent years. And I'm the researcher and I say the dropout rate is all we're using to close schools or keep them open. People would be outraged. And I would be claiming to help you with my expertise about what good schools are without ever measuring whether you're actually delivering on those promises. So in a school setting, again, and some people could say that's exactly what we've done recently, is just look at dropout rates or just standardized test scores, and that is a problem. But what about if you really cared, if you were the principal of the school and you really cared and you had the resources to do this, you would want to have much more observations of teaching. You'd want to have people in the classroom watching teaching. You'd want to have regular interviews with the students in that school and ask them what they think about this teacher versus that teacher. And you'd want to have lots of detail about classes they took and extracurriculars they're involved in, and what's the day, how's the day managed, how do they get called to change classes, and how respected are they by the school administration. All those mechanics is what we need to measure in order to turn this into an evidence-based practice. What really concerns me, and I said this before, I talked to a judge once, and I was describing positive outcomes and positive youth development and how important that is. And this judge actually said to me, "Oh, I'm all in favor of that fluff. It's important that we have that." And I thought, well, there you go. As long as this stuff is considered fluff, and as opposed to the meat and potatoes of justice are punishments and rules and controls and fencing, we are never going to solve this problem. And we're going to be living in ignorance of basic insights from adolescent development, adolescent science. So connect these things is a challenge, but I think it is doable. We just have to measure everything along the way in order to develop the evidence.
Great. Thanks. And there's another question here. It's a statement and then a question. Given the complexity of this topic and the participant is acknowledging it's complex, are there maybe a small handful, 3 or 4 indicators that you would advise jurisdictions to initially focus on for tracking purposes? I mean, I'm sure, you named a few things just now, but I'm sure there are some huge number of possible indicators. But, in your work, Jeff, and your work, Phil, have you seen, 2, 3, or 4 of these indicators that you think would really be helpful in trying to promote a positive youth approach as far as school is concerned and improving those educational outcomes for the youth?
Phil, do you want to go?
Well, let me just take a shot at this. That's an interesting question, but I don't think it's a question I would want to answer quickly. I would want to know what your goals are, and start with kind of your high priority goals, what you've been working on, where you are in terms of the development of your own educational system, and then say, okay, here's a goal that you want to work on. Let's think about how you can break that down into smaller goal steps and what kinds of data you might need to measure success. It's easy to say, yeah, you can measure, core knowledge, core subject knowledge, or you can even measure educational attitudes. There are scales for measuring academic self-concept. But I don't think we want to separate that question from your own agency experience.
Right.
And I'll just add one thing, which is I would recommend also that people do what's easiest first. If you have existing administrative data that would allow you to construct, even if they're not perfect measures, they're indicators of involvement of young people in educational efforts and something about their response, whether it's simple attendance or participation, anything that's already collected administratively, start there and then confront the harder task as you go forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Take what you have and really analyze what you have and see what that story, what it tells you as far as the story is concerned, and then move along further. Yeah, that's a great point. So we have another couple of questions. What outcome data would help teachers learn how to be a little more effective in the jobs that they do?
Wow.
So when you say outcome data, I assume the questioner meant student outcomes. And
yes.
I think, yeah, obviously education is much more than the information, facts, and skills being imparted by education. It's also firing up their passion for learning and their belief in themselves that they can learn, whatever area it is. So I think, to me, I would look for outcomes that are, more, and, Phil mentioned attitudinal. There's also just engagement. If I were teaching a college class and I offered an extra help session after the regular class and no one stayed, I would know that I was in trouble, that either people didn't like me, they were bored by the class. So have an opportunity to let the eager learners identify themselves would be a good outcome to measure. So I guess the basic insight here is getting past, if it's an algebra class, especially in the youth justice setting, you're doing more than teaching algebra. You're, again, getting someone excited about learning, having them learn the experience of working in a group. I know what saved me in a lot of my math classes, even in college, was not sitting in the class listening to the instructor, it was the study group. So having young people break up into small groups and teach themselves and have that recognition from their peers about learning. It needs to be managed, and be careful about how you set that up. But I would focus on those things if I were in that position.
Okay, great, thanks. A few more questions. Typically when we look at the juvenile justice involved youth, we look at youngsters who are 18 and younger, or 17 and younger. But one of our participants is asking, can the positive youth justice philosophy that you've talked about on this call apply to older adolescents, young adults at 18 to 25-year-old age group who may actually be in the adult system?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I question whether or not it ever becomes not useful. You know, I'm in my 70s and I'm still learning and still enjoying learning. I think that's the whole thing about becoming a lifelong learner. You know, it's getting excited about the process of learning. So yeah, I know it's more difficult sometimes in prison settings to develop programs and deliver services that are from this frame of reference, but it's certainly not impossible. It really is a matter of saying, well, what are helping this person develop their interests and think about themselves as a person who's going to be continuing to explore life and become successful and continue to be successful.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. You don't just cut this off when someone reaches the age of criminal court jurisdiction. When we even the term adolescent extends, depending on how you measure it, it extends well into the mid-20s. And as Phil points out, especially in his own case, it could sometimes go way beyond that. So I think you do have to pay attention to older youth or young adults. And I visited McLaren once recently outside of Salem, Oregon, and they have this very creative system where they have older young people or young adults basically in the same facility with the younger teens, and they use that. There's nothing a 17-year-old wants more than the attention of a 22-year-old and 23-year-old. Maybe that's an overstatement, but they love the attention of the young adults. And to tap into that, it makes sense. I always say this to people, but the youth justice system should be at least as good as a street gang in understanding what motivates young people to get involved in a group, play by the rules, and to follow the leader. Street gangs are excellent at that. They know exactly how to motivate young people, and we should at least be that good.
Yeah, and I think related to that, at McLaren, they offer classes that staff and students can take together. So you got staff and students, learning Chinese. So that creates a different kind of relationship between staff and young people when they're learning together.
Okay, very good. We have another couple of questions. I think we have time for a couple more. This participant said that they wondered if you mentioned any specific tools or surveys that are validated for measuring protective factors. This person goes on to say that they use the Risk and Protective Factor Survey right now, but are open to looking at maybe other measures if you felt as though there were better measures out there, better tools out there.
Well, that one slide that I showed that had the list of different tools, all of them have risk and protective factors built into them. I mean, that's what they're looking at. They're looking at the balance between risk factors that predict subsequent offending, and factors that predict an absence of those subsequent reoffending. So I would say that those instruments, the PACT and the YLS, CMI, and those all have protective factors embedded in them. It's part of the thinking about the development of the tool.
But keep in mind one thing, and Phil just said something important, which I would correct you, Phil. You said they are correlated, or they're measured on their connection to offending. We have no such thing as data about offending. We only have data about who's had law enforcement contact and been processed by that contact.
That's a very good point.
So I think people need to remember, I have arguments all the time with the people from the R&R school, the risk, needs, and responsivity, that their whole empire of risk assessment and analysis is based upon the outcome being official recidivism, which means everything that goes into official recidivism other than the youth-owned behavior is bound up in that score. And by that I mean the neighborhood you live in, the intensity of policing and surveillance, not just the neighborhood, but in the surveillance of yourself once the police think you're a high-risk person. All that's bound up in the score. So you just have to keep in mind that it's important to measure risk and needs, and it's important to measure strengths and assets, but it's only a guideline. It's only a suggestion about how to deal with a young person. If we just treated everyone according to their risk and need scores, we would make things worse. You still need human judgment.
And I think what Jeff is saying too is that these risk measures are inherently biased in terms of the police responses to certain neighborhoods that generate arrest data. I mean, that's there. So we're starting out with biased data. The other thing to keep in mind is that there's this hidden figure of crime, right? There are all the offenses that kids commit that we don't know anything about. We have no way of measuring that. We could have 15 offenses for everyone we know about. So it's a pretty tricky area for evaluation and prediction.
Thank you. We have another couple of questions. There's certainly lots of evaluation studies out there that use recidivism as a measure of success. Are these studies useful, especially to us in the education field?
Boy, I would, that's the last clause that set me back. If you're trying to increase a young person's ability to learn and their enthusiasm for learning, I would almost want the classroom people not to know about the criminal history or illegal behavior of their students. And I'm sure that's not realistic, but you'd almost want to have a willful blindness to that and just treat every young person as a potential learner.
Mm.
Okay.
Was that question related to program evaluations? Because
I don't know.
I interpreted it as a question about here we got this whole library full of evaluations of programs, and by and large they're based on, they've used recidivism as their major measure of success.
Right.
So when we look at evidence-based programs and we say, okay, well, their measure of success was recidivism, and that's not useful, what happens to the whole body of literature? Do we continue to use it? Do we use it with caution? How do we look at it? I'd be very cautious myself. I want more, I think the point Jeff made was that nothing is carved in stone when it comes to outcomes. We're still learning. We're still learning how to measure. We're still learning what to measure. We're still learning what works, what doesn't, what causes harm. You know, we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, this is Simo, I'm not sure if the person who submitted the question was asking a question, something without a lot of detail, but something to the effect, if a youngster recidivates because he hasn't been able to re-engage in school, or has been moved from school again as a factor, not the only factor, but as a factor, should we look at that as a system as far as evaluation of our programming? Maybe the education program was solid, but potentially the reentry efforts or the transition efforts are not. They need in order to really support that youngster and the family. I mean, I'm just kind of, when I read through it, I said, I wonder if that's what the person meant. I don't know. Case recidivism information could potentially be helpful if you look at it connected to the type of programming that a youngster's provided. If you have 25 youngsters who transition out during a 3-month period of time, and you have X number that come back, can you look at maybe the different levels of transition services you provided for that youngster and see if you can see if there's some common factor around those who remained out and those that didn't. I mean, so that's how I kind of interpreted this, but I could be wrong,
Okay.
Yeah. So in that case, let me just accept, would it be beneficial for the organization to look at recidivism data, getting down to the level of programming potentially that they provided for that youngster? Say this is his second admission.
Mm-hmm.
necessarily arrest, but actually admission.
Mm-hmm.
This is a deep conversation to have, and I would encourage people to just start off acknowledging that recidivism is part of our task environment and we have to pay attention to it, but not to turn it into a fetish. Everything needs to be judged in terms of recidivism, because as I said before, you're allowing your local police practices, prosecutor behaviors, judicial temperament, community resources, all those things get bound up in a young person's likelihood of getting brought back into the system. And as long as you're conscious of that and you're looking at that score as including all those things, it's still useful. But the mistake is when people think it's like in a health setting, it's like blood pressure and pulse. It's not the basic indicator of someone's well-being.
Oh, exactly. And we need to remember, the youth is still on a developmental trajectory. Well, let's take a read of where this kid is in terms of all the components of positive youth development at this point in time. Where is this kid? And let's help this kid move forward.
There is one more question, and I'll try to get it in real quickly. It may be related to this conversation, actually. Are the positive indicators important by themselves, or as they are related to the reduction of criminal behavior? Should we look at how the positive indicators then relate to crime?
Yeah, which is a different way of, and I think a more pointed and productive way of thinking about what we were just talking about, that there's enough research to say that if someone has all these positive assets in their life, they're less likely to engage in ongoing criminal behavior. But rather than treat all the positive efforts as a black box and then we just measure the criminal behavior, which, as I said before, you get bound up with all the environmental, everything else, to actually measure those inputs along the way is the way we will make these things an evidence-based program. And I think the policy world will be they will hunger less after recidivism data if they're showed regular positive outcomes: school enrollment, school completion, employability, holding down a job, being connected with a family, successful parenting. If all those things were a regular data point that's produced by systems, I don't think you'd have state and local officials clamoring so much for the recidivism number.
Gotcha. Yeah, really good point. I think that last question sort of drove some of those earlier questions home. So thanks, Jeff, for summarizing that. Phil, did you need to add anything, or?
No, I think what Jeff said was really great.
Yeah, it was tremendous. Well, I want to thank both Phil and Jeff for their time today and for really handling a tough, complex topic here for us on our PYO call today. I'll turn things over to Peter Forbes, who will talk to you a little bit about feedback from this webinar, and then also the possibility of future calls for the work group. Dan Sullivan. Are you there?
Sorry about that. Yes, I am. I just got a phone call. I want to thank Simone, Phil, and Jeff. And Jeff started out with this at the beginning of this, saying that this is complicated, and then he went ahead and demonstrated that this is complicated. So thank you for delivering on that, Jeff. A couple things. One is we have a couple of additional webinars. We're planning to do one in November on special education, and we're going to then close out on a webinar regarding policy implications. So we have a couple more that we're working on. And what Simone was referencing is, as you close out of the webinar today, it would be really helpful if you plug into the survey link and give us feedback on this. We are taking the feedback seriously, and it's very much useful and appreciated. So thank all of you for joining us. Thank you to CJCA. Thank you to the presenters, and look forward to talking to you soon.